The candles in the upper corridor of Ashmore Hall had burned low by the time the Duke of Ashmore crossed the ballroom floor, and every head in the room turned to watch him do it. He did not walk toward the Dowager, though she stood at the center of the assembled company, with her fan raised and her verdict already rendered aloud. He did not walk toward Miss Cecily Frome, who stood at the Dowager's right hand, in ivory silk and perfect composure. He walked toward the woman in the plain gray gown who stood near the east door, with her hands folded at her waist and her chin level, and he walked toward her as though there were no other direction in the room. What Eliza Hartwell did not yet know, as he covered those last 10 yards of polished floor, was that he had been walking toward her since the night he had stood in a cold corridor and watched her read aloud to a child who was not her own. She had come to Ashmore Hall in Derbyshire 6 days before Christmas as a companion to Mrs. Penwarren, her mother's distant cousin, a fretful widow who required attendance at dinner and someone to agree with her at cards. It was not a proud position. Eliza was 23 years old, and she understood with the calm precision that poverty teaches that it was the only one available to her. Her father had died in March, leaving Hartwell House encumbered with a debt of £400, and a male entail that her cousin Gerald considered his personal inheritance. The season had been her last reasonable corridor to a life that did not require her to be useful to strangers, in exchange for room and meals, and the season had been unkind, so she had accepted Mrs. Arkey. Penwarren's offer and packed 2 evening gowns, one of which she had retrimmed in December in an attempt to pass it off as something other than what it was. It remained what it was. She wore it on the evening of the winter assembly at Ashmore Hall, and she was aware, walking up the stone steps at Mrs. Penwarren's side, that the gray silk was correct in every material and incorrect in every impression. It had been her mother's. It fit her well enough. It had never once in its long existence been fashionable. Lady Dorothea Vane was standing at the assembly's threshold when they arrived, receiving the company in the company of her nephew, the Duke. Eliza had not expected to be received at all, not meaningfully, but Lady Dorothea had a gift for meaningful omission. When Mrs. Penwarren presented her, the Dowager's gaze moved from Eliza's face to her gown, to the small beaded evening bag she carried, which had also been her mother's, and back to Mrs. Penwarren's expectant smile. "A companion," Lady Dorothea said. "Not a question, a correction. How thoughtful of you to bring her, Mrs. Penwarren. We shall find somewhere to put her." The phrase rang in the marbled entry hall with perfect clarity, and 2 women standing near the column to the left exchanged a look that Eliza recognized without needing to see it directly. She kept her chin level. She accepted the small humiliation the way one accepts cold weather, without performance, and without pretending it was not cold. The Duke of Ashmore had stood 3 feet away during the exchange. He had been in the act of turning to greet the next arrivals when Lady Dorothea spoke. Eliza did not see what his face did in the half-second before his attention moved on. She did not see it, because she had already looked away. The assembly room was warm and bright, and hung with winter greenery, and the assembled company of Derbyshire filled it with the particular self-satisfaction of people who have been told their county is picturesque. Eliza had been to any number of such assemblies as herself, as Miss Hartwell of Hartwell House, with her father's name, and a modest but respectable expectation of the future. She had not been to one as a companion before. Tonight, and the difference was instructive. People who had spoken to her in previous years hesitated for half a breath before doing so, now as though recalibrating. Several decided against it. Gerald Hardwell, her cousin, was not present that first evening. He had sent word to her at the inn in Hallow Cross where she and Mrs. Metter Penwarren were lodged, a letter in his cramped legal hand, noting that the £400 debt on Hartwell House was, in his view, an obstacle to her continued tenancy rather than a matter she might reasonably settle from her own resources. He had suggested in the letter's final paragraph that a sensible arrangement might be reached between them. He did not specify the terms of the arrangement. He did not need to. Gerald had been suggesting sensible arrangements since before Eliza's father was buried. She folded the letter into the bottom of her trunk and did not reply. The first proximity with the Duke of Ashmore occurred on the second evening, in the east corridor that connected the assembly rooms to the smaller withdrawing room where Mrs. Penwarren liked to play at whist. Eliza had been returning from the withdrawing room carrying a cup of negus that Mrs. Penwarren had asked for, and then forgotten. When Gerald appeared at the corridor's far end, he had arrived at the hall that afternoon. He was a tall man with the Hartwell jaw and none of the Hartwell warmth, and he had positioned himself in the corridor with the particular ease of someone who believes a narrowed passage works in his favor. Eliza stopped walking. She did not intend to turn back, but she assessed the distance between herself and him with a precision that her body understood, even when she told herself there was nothing to assess. She did not see the Duke until he was beside her, because he had come from the withdrawing room's direction without sound, and had simply arrived at her shoulder, close enough that she felt the displacement of air as he adjusted his stride to hers. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was level, without inflection, the kind of voice that expected to be heard. He took her arm, not forcefully, not with any performance of gallantry, but with the quiet authority of a man who had decided a thing and was doing it. His hand at her elbow was gloved and firm, and steered her cleanly past Gerald with 3 extra inches of corridor between them. And Gerald had not been prepared for the Duke's presence, because one generally was not. Gerald stepped aside. The corridor was narrow, and the Duke of Ashmore filled it, not with his size, which was considerable, but with something else entirely. The quality of a man to whom obstruction does not occur as a relevant concept. "Your Grace," Gerald said, with the reflexive deference of a man who had spent 30 years cultivating people with titles. The Duke did not answer him. He delivered Eliza to the assembly room's threshold, and released her arm with the same absence of ceremony with which he had taken it. And then he asked, without apparent reason, whether she had found the east corridor adequately warm. Eliza looked at him. He was watching her with gray eyes that gave nothing away, the face entirely composed, the jaw she had heard 2 women describe as carved, which was accurate as descriptions went. Adequately, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. She could not have named what it was. He inclined his head and was gone before she could decide whether the exchange had meant anything at all. She decided it had not meant anything. This was her wound's best argument, and she made it fluently, having had practice. The winter assembly at Ashmore Hall ran for 5 days. Mrs. Alden, a widow of 70, who lived in the village adjacent to the Hartwell estate, had come to Derbyshire to visit her daughter, whose own daughter, a child of 7, called Rose, had taken a fever 2 days into the assembly's opening, Tumber. Eliza knew Mrs. Alden from the years when Hartwell House had still been a place one visited without apology. She had been kind to Eliza's mother. She was kind to Eliza now in the specific way of a woman who recognized constraint, and did not embarrass it with excessive sympathy. On the 3rd evening of the assembly, an invitation arrived for Eliza through a most unlikely channel, a note from the assembly's host, delivered by a footman in the hall livery, requesting her presence at a small informal supper that the Duke intended for a select company of 8. It was phrased as an invitation. It had the particular quality of an invitation that, if accepted, might alter the shape of the weeks ahead. Eliza held the note for a long moment and thought about it. Mrs. Alden's granddaughter had taken a turn for the worse that afternoon. The doctor was 2 hours away by horse, and the roads were not favorable. Mrs. Bawley. Alden's daughter was not a strong woman in practical circumstances, and Rose was 7 years old, and feverish, and frightened. And the only story she would accept at bedtime was one about a girl who lived in a house full of birds, which Eliza had been making up for her in installments since Tuesday. Eliza sent a polite note of regret regarding the supper. She put on her wool shawl and went to Mrs. Alden's borrowed rooms instead. She read aloud for 4 hours. Rose slept near midnight, the fever still high but no longer climbing, and Eliza stayed and read in a lower voice until the candle beside her had burned past its collar, and the room had grown cold enough that she could see her own breath. She had not told anyone she was going. She did not consider telling anyone. There was a child who needed the story, and she was the person who knew the story, and no other calculation seemed particularly relevant. She did not know that the Duke of Ashmore stood in the corridor outside the door for a portion of that time. He had been passing on his way back from the estate's east wing, where an estate matter had pulled him after supper. He had heard her voice through the half-inch gap of a door that had not properly latched, and he had stood in the cold corridor in his evening coat and listened to her read about a girl in a house full of birds, and something in his face had done a thing it had not done in several years, which was to be entirely unguarded. He had lost his wife, Marian, 4 winters ago. He had lost her in childbed, and the child had lived, and the child's name was Charlotte, and Charlotte did not speak. She had been 7 years old since September, and she had not spoken a word since she was 3 when her mother died, and the Duke of Ashmore had done every reasonable thing man of his resources could arrange, and none of it had touched the silence. He had sent Charlotte to his sister in Bath because Marian had made him promise before she died that he would not try to raise a child alone in a cold house, and because he had believed, at 38 years old, and in the 4th year, of a grief that had calcified into something administrative, that he had honored his promise. What he had not admitted to himself until recently was that Charlotte's silence had deepened in Bath, not lessened, and that sending her away had been easier than staying with the silence in the same rooms where Marian had moved and laughed, and asked him not to be so serious at dinner. The portrait in the gallery still faced the wall. He had turned it himself, and had not turned it back. He stood in the corridor outside the borrowed room and listened to the woman in the plain gray gown read a story to a sick child, and he did not interrupt her, and he did not announce himself, and he remained there until the child's breathing settled into sleep. Then he went back to his own wing of the house and sat for a considerable time before the fire in the library, with an untouched glass of brandy, and the specific discomfort of a man who has been shown something he did not give himself permission to need. Eliza knew nothing of this. She went back to her own room near 2 in the morning, and slept in her clothes for 3 hours before Mrs. Penwarren required her at breakfast. On the 4th day, Gerald came to find her. He chose the drawing-room mid-morning when Mrs. Penwarren was resting, and the other guests were occupied. He sat across from Eliza in a chair that he arranged, with his usual precision, and placed the entail notice on the table between them. It was a legal document with the solicitor's seal at the base, naming the £400 and its implications in clear, direct language. He watched her read it. "I am not," he said, "without sympathy for your situation, Eliza." She finished reading before she answered him. "I had not noticed any evidence of that, Gerald." His jaw tightened. "The debt is attached to the property. The entail runs to the male line. You know as well as I do what this means." "I know what you believe it means. It means that Hartwell House passes to me when the note falls due in March, unless I accept whatever arrangement you have in mind," she said. "You have been circling that sentence for 8 months. I would prefer you finished it." Gerald had not expected this directness, or not this particular quality of it, the kind that does not raise its voice, and therefore cannot be answered with volume. He restated his position using more formal language. The effect was the same. Eliza folded the entail notice and returned it to him across the table. She did not accept his arrangement. She did not accept his sympathy. She told him she would need until March to determine her options, and when he began to speak again, she stood, which ended the conversation by making continued sitting seem foolish. He left with the document and without the compliance he had come for, and Eliza stood at the drawing-room window for a moment and allowed herself to feel the weight of it, which was not panic and was not defeat, but was the specific heaviness of a door narrowing toward a smaller and smaller opening. That evening was the winter ball. The formal event of the assembly, the one for which the chandelier had been cleaned and the musicians traveled from Sheffield, the one at which Lady Dorothea Vane intended to present Miss Cecily Frome to the Duke of Ashmore as the unambiguous and appropriate culmination of the season's social logic. Cecily was 18 and assured, and wore a gown of deep rose that had been designed for exactly this evening. She moved through the assembly room with the particular ease of a young woman who had been told her whole life that the world was organized in her favor, which it largely had been, and who had not yet encountered a single instance of that organization failing. Eliza wore the gray silk again. She attended as Mrs. Penwarren's companion, which meant she stood where Mrs. Penwarren stood, and fetched what Mrs. Penwarren required, and was addressed by Mrs. Penwarren's acquaintances in the particular tone that registers a woman as part of the furniture. She was near the fireplace with a cup of tea. She had not asked for when Lady Dorothea approached her. The dowager wore silver tonight, and her diamonds were the kind that had been in a family long enough to stop being impressive and start being simply expected. She looked at Eliza with the calm authority of a woman who has never once doubted the accuracy of her own assessments. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "in the private register of a woman who intends to be overheard by exactly the 3 nearest people. Or is it still Miss Hartwell? I had understood from your cousin that your circumstances had materially changed." "My name has not changed, Lady Dorothea." "No, I imagine not." The fan moved once, a small calibrated gesture. "It is kind of Mrs. Penwarren to bring you out. One ought to be useful when one can. A companion's position is a respectable one, provided one does not mistake it for something else." Eliza met her gaze without flinching. "I have no confusion on the matter." Lady Dorothea smiled, the kind of smile that closes a door with perfect courtesy. "Of course not, my dear." She moved away toward Cecily, who was waiting for her at the far side of the room, and the 3 nearest people did exactly what they had been assembled to do, which was to have heard it. If you have or found yourself in a room where someone has just been quietly and precisely reduced to her correct social category in front of witnesses, you understand what the air in that room feels like for the 3 minutes after. If that story is the kind that stays with you, leave a word in the comments, and then come back with me to the ballroom, because the evening was not yet finished. The musicians had begun the second set when Gerald came in from the East Passage, and he did not come alone. He had brought the solicitor from Hallow Cross, a thin man named Rawlins who wore an expression of apologetic professional necessity, and who had not, Liza suspected, been told the full purpose of the evening's errand. Gerald had the entail notice in his hand. He had also somehow told at least 4 other guests about the nature of the document, because the cluster of people who moved aside to let him pass were the particular expression of spectators who knew they were about to see something. Gerald spoke at a volume that was technically private and practically not. Quote, he addressed Eliza in the language of the document, which was careful and formal and devastating, and he placed the notice in her hand with the specific confidence of a man who had arranged the room, the timing, and the witnesses in advance, and saw no reason the next 30 seconds would fail to go as planned. "The note falls due in March," he said, "and in the event of non-payment, the property's disposition is legally straightforward. I do not enjoy this, Eliza." "I know," she said. Then Lady Dorothea Vane's voice rose from across the room, clear and carrying, and addressed to no one and everyone at once. "I did try to make the arrangements clear from the beginning," she said to the small circle around her, which now included Cecily and 2 of the most reliable gossips in Derbyshire. "A companion attends to her duties. She does not impose herself on the occasion. Miss Hartwell has had every opportunity to understand her position this week, and I fear she has chosen not to. The room heard it. The room absorbed it." Eliza felt the sound land in her chest like the closing of a heavy ledger, and she stood with Gerald's notice in her hand and the dowager's words settling around her like dropped ash, and she did not cry, and she did not flinch, and she said, quietly, to no one in particular. "I have understood my position very clearly," Eliza said. "I understood it the night Mrs. Secretion. Alden's granddaughter was ill when I chose to sit with a sick child rather than accept a supper invitation that might have changed how this week ended. I made that choice willingly. I would make it again, and—" "A person's worth is not determined by the number of correct invitations accepted, Lady Dorothea. But I think you know that, and I think it does not suit the present arrangement to say so." The room had gone quiet in the specific way of rooms where something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Lady Dorothea's fan stilled. Cecily's composed expression acquired a faint uncertainty at its edges. Gerald looked at Eliza with something that was not quite surprise, and was not quite anger, a kind of recalculation, the face of a man who has measured a space incorrectly. The musicians had stopped between figures. In that silence, at the far end of the ballroom, the Duke of Ashmore moved. He came from near the long windows where he had been standing for the better part of the last 15 minutes with a glass of wine he had not touched. He had heard Gerald's recitation. He had heard Lady Dorothea's assessment. He had heard Eliza's answer, which was the answer of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and had chosen to spend that freedom on honesty rather than on anything else. He had stood in a cold corridor 4 nights ago, and listened to her read a story about a house full of birds to a child who was not hers, and the thing that had happened in his face then happened again now. But this time, he did not turn away from it. He crossed the ballroom floor in 10 measured strides, and the crowd adjusted to make room without being asked, the way crowds do when something is happening that exceeds the normal social protocols. He stopped in front of Eliza. He took her arm, not as he had in the corridor on the second evening, not as a practical intervention to redirect her path. He took her arm the way a man takes an arm when he is making a statement, rather than providing navigation. The inside of her gloved hand settled on his sleeve, his posture beside hers, a statement that required no words to translate. The room understood it immediately. Several people understood it with the quality of understanding that produces an involuntary intake of breath. "Miss Hartwell," the Duke said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "sat with Mrs. Dree, Alden's granddaughter, for 4 hours on Thursday night, when the child was at her worst. She did this having declined, that same evening, an invitation to my table. I was aware of the first fact before I was aware of the second. Mrs. Was, Alden informed me on Friday morning." He looked at Gerald once with the direct and level quality of a man who is not issuing a threat, but is stating the terms of a resolved situation. "Miss Hartwell's debt of £400 on Hartwell House will be satisfied in full before the 1st of March. The matter of the entail is accordingly closed. Mr. Rollins will be available to verify the arrangement at his convenience." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet in the room had become the kind of quiet that carries perfectly. Miss Hartwell is not a companion. She has not been asked to attend this assembly in that capacity by any authority I would recognize. Lady Dorothea Vane stood very still. The diamonds caught the light at her throat. For a moment her face had the expression of a woman recalibrating an entire architecture of certainty, and Eliza watched the confidence leave it, not in a collapse, but in a slow, irrevocable tide, the face of someone whose instrument has failed in front of the audience she assembled. The fan remained motionless in her hand. "Your Grace," Lady Dorothea said, and then nothing followed. She was not a woman without dignity. She gathered what remained of her composure and inclined her head. Once the acknowledgement of someone who has been corrected by the one authority she cannot dismiss, and she did not protest, and she did not amplify, and she sat down. Cecily, to her credit, did not create an incident. She looked at the Duke's arm and Eliza's hand resting on it, and she looked away, and her expression was the expression of a young woman who is young enough to absorb this kind of information and file it correctly. She moved, quietly, toward the far side of the room. Gerald attempted to speak to the solicitor in an undertone. Rollins answered him with the short, firm patience of a man who has been told one version of an event and has just understood there was another version, and the conversation ended in under 40 seconds. With Gerald pocketing the entail notice, with the slightly stunned economy of a man whose leverage has just been weighed against a duke's personal word, and found lighter than anticipated. Mrs. Alden stood near the east door, where she had been for the last quarter of an hour. her hands folded at her waist, and her expression the particular serenity of a woman of 70 who has watched enough human machinery to recognize when it is grinding to a necessary stop. She met Eliza's gaze from across the room and said nothing, because she did not need to. Eliza felt the look as one feels the warmth of a room after a long time in the cold, a physical fact rather than a sentiment. The musicians began again. The notes climbed up through the chandelier light and into the evening, and the room moved back into its shapes, and Eliza stood at the Duke's side, with her hand on his arm, and understood that the world had just rearranged itself around her, not because of anything she had declared or demanded or performed, but because she had sat with a sick child in a cold room and read a story about a house full of birds, and someone had been paying attention. She looked up at the Duke. He was watching her with the gray eyes that gave nothing away, and also, she now understood, gave everything away to anyone who had learned to read them. "You knew," she said. "You stood in the corridor." "I was returning from the East Wing." That is not an answer. Something at the corner of his mouth moved again, and this time she recognized it for what it was. It was not quite a smile, but it was the direction of one which in this face was the equivalent of a great deal. "No," he said. "It is not." She did not press him further. There would be time for further, and she was beginning to understand that she had been granted the considerable improbable gift of time. The rest of the evening moved in the way of evenings that have already concluded their essential business, warm and bright and populated with the particular social activity of people who are discussing what they just witnessed and calling it something else. Mrs. Penwarren, to her lasting credit, found Eliza near 11 o'clock and pressed her hand warmly without saying anything beyond, "Well done, my dear," which was precisely the right amount. Mrs. Alden embraced her with the brief firmness of a woman who has never believed in long embraces, but believes completely in the thing they signify. Gerald left before midnight. He did not say goodbye. Lady Dorothea, in the carriage on her way back to her own lodgings, sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face in the careful expression of a woman engaged in private accounting. She had not destroyed Eliza. She had not destroyed the season. She had, she acknowledged to herself in the dark of the carriage, misjudged the value of a thing her categories had not contained. And the Duke of Ashmore had corrected that misjudgment before witnesses, and in terms she had not been able to answer. She was not a small woman. She was a woman whose instrument had failed. There was a difference. The following morning the Duke called at the inn in Hallow Cross. He called formally, with a card presented to Mrs. Penwarren, and a request that was phrased as a question, rather than a command, which Eliza noted with a quality of attention she did not attempt to hide from herself. He asked whether she would be willing to remain in Derbyshire for a further fortnight. He had a matter he wished to discuss with her concerning the west wing of Ashmore Hall, and the arrangement of certain rooms that were at present underused. Mrs. Penwarren, who was not without understanding, excused herself to attend to correspondence. Eliza told the Duke that she would consider it. She considered it for approximately 4 seconds. "Yes," she said. The fortnight extended into January. The matter of the West Wing was discussed, and then the matter of Charlotte, who arrived from Bath on the 5th of January with her small trunk and her particular silence and her gray eyes, which were so precisely her father's that Eliza felt her breath catch the first time the child looked at her directly. Charlotte was 7 years old and careful and had not spoken in 4 years, and she accepted Eliza's presence in her father's house with the deliberate, watchful calm of a child who has decided to take a significant amount of time before deciding anything. Eliza read to her. She did not read the bird story, not at first. She read other stories, animals and gardens and a girl who could speak to rivers, and she sat in the window seat in Charlotte's room in the afternoons while the snow came down on the Derbyshire hills. She did not require Charlotte to respond, and she did not require herself to perform confidence she did not feel. The Duke of Ashmore asked her, on the 14th of January in the library, with a fire at the grate, and a document on the table between them that was not an entail notice. It was not a long proposal. He was not a man who had ever found extended declaration to be his register. He told her what he knew about her. He told her what he had understood from the corridor on Thursday night. He told her about Marion and the portrait and the specific error of calculation he had made when he sent Charlotte to Bath. The error of a man who had confused administrative grief with actual grief and called the exchange a kindness. He told her about the portrait being faced away and what it had meant for him to understand in the 4th year. That facing it again was not a betrayal of what he had lost, but a recognition of what he still had. Eliza listened. She did not deflect. She had spent 23 years becoming excellent at deflection, and she had decided somewhere between the ballroom and the library to stop being so skilled at it. She accepted him. The law required its satisfactions, and Rawlins came from Hallow Cross on the 19th of January with the relevant document, and the £400 was settled, and Hartwell House passed cleanly out of Gerald's reach. Gerald did not contest it. He was not, in the end, a man with the appetite for a fight he could not win, and the Duke's personal intervention in a debt settlement was not a fight any sensible person undertook twice. The wedding was small, by the deliberate preference of both parties. Lady Dorothea attended. She sat in the front pew of the Ashmore Chapel with her back very straight and her diamonds subdued for the occasion. And when Eliza passed her on the way to the door, she met the Dowager's eyes, and the Dowager gave her a single nod, the kind that carries more information than most speeches. Eliza returned it with equal economy. It was not forgiveness, and it was not fellowship, but it was something, the acknowledgement of two women who understood each other's arithmetic even when they did not agree on the sums. Cecily Frome was not in attendance. She was already in London with her mother, and the season's next chapter was already being arranged. And she was, by all reports, conducting herself with the particular resilience of a young woman whose confidence has absorbed one serious correction, and is choosing to learn from it rather than from the alternative. Charlotte did not attend the wedding. She stayed in the nursery with her nurse and a book about a river which she had asked for by pointing at the shelf with a deliberateness that her nurse understood perfectly. She used no words for this, but she had been considering words for several weeks. The west sitting room at Ashmore Hall had a window that faced the late afternoon sky over the northern hills, and in January the snow came early and stayed, and by the last week of the month it had settled against the panes in a way that made the glass glow in the early evening like something lit from inside. Eliza had come to think of that window as hers, which was a thought she held carefully the way one holds a new and somewhat fragile thing that one does not want to damage by gripping it too firmly. She was reading in the west sitting room on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding, with the fire at the grate and the snow falling steadily outside, when she heard the door open behind her. She had learned Charlotte's footstep. It was lighter than the nurse's and more deliberate. A child who moved with intention through a house she was only now beginning to inhabit as something other than a temporary arrangement. She did not look up immediately, not wanting to interrupt whatever Charlotte had decided to do. The child came into the room and stood for a moment at the edge of the firelight. And then she crossed to the window seat and sat beside Eliza with the precise economy of a person who has made a decision and is enacting it. They sat together and watched the snow. The fire shifted. Outside, the light was very nearly gone, the last gray of the afternoon giving way to the blue-white of a snowed evening, and the hills were invisible behind the weather, and the window glowed. Charlotte's hand moved across the cushion between them and found Eliza's wrist. Eliza did not move. Charlotte looked at the snow for another long moment, the gray eyes very still and very careful. Then, in a voice that was small and slightly rough from long disuse but perfectly legible, she said one word: "Eliza." The fire settled, the snow came down on the northern hills and on the window of the west sitting room, and Eliza held very still and felt the warmth of a child's hand at her wrist and the specific weight of a word that had been 4 years in the returning. And she understood that this was the name of the house she had been delivered into, and that it had been waiting for her longer than either of them had known. If Eliza's journey has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments, and let others who would love this story find it. The kindness travels further than you might think.